language, sound design, acting, directing actors, editing, and many more things. But of course, this masterclass is open to your questions and themes you would like to talk about. So do not hesitate to raise your hand or keep your question, and there will be enough time in the end of the masterclass to ask for you, I think. We might start biographically, let's say. You were born in Cheltenham, which is West Midlands, place where better things take place, your first feature film. So what impact did it have on you?
It's kind of summed up in there, I guess, really. I mean, that piece was kind of done just after I'd done Better Things, and it's part of a group of works which are called Sunday, and I think it's about 12 pieces. And it was kind of a reaction to needing to do like a narrative which can hold people for kind of 90 minutes. And I had kind of all this footage, and I was offered an exhibition at a place called the Baltic, because they also knew that I did photography. But when they offered me the show, I said what I'd really like to do is to go back to these rushes and kind of explore them in a different way, because I think there's a lot of other work that I can kind of make from these rushes. And the reason I wanted to do that was because I didn't really feel that I'd done a piece, because Better Things is a 90-minute narrative, so you've got to have kind of this other dramatic kind of development, you know? And what I felt I could do with these pieces was kind of sum up what it feels like to grow up in a small village or a small kind of town. So I remembered very much kind of moments like that, where I'm kind of just on my own, my friends have just gone home, we've hung out for the night, but I'm having a cigarette on my own before I kind of go home to my parents. And that's what I wanted to do with all of those pieces, was really kind of strip away. You're not really stripping away all narrative, you're just trying to strip it away so what you're working with is just the atmosphere. Because that's what I really remember from the place, kind of growing up, was just this atmosphere of, it wasn't kind of isolation or kind of being alone or anything like that. It was just a feeling of being alive in this environment where the stimulus is quite minimal, you know, and you're very aware and kind of, you know, I didn't have the language then to really understand it, but you're very aware of kind of the temporal kind of quality of it, you know, of just a feeling of being alive kind of in that space. So I did like kind of 12 pieces which kind of articulated it all, you know, I think. You know, also at that point we were doing, if you go up somewhere which is quite boring and there isn't too much stimulus, then drugs are very good. You know, and some of the pieces have quite a kind of drugged kind of atmosphere to them. You know, and you kind of experiment with a lot of those things. And Better Things was also an attempt to say that there's quite an aggressive type of experimentation that exists within adolescent kind of groups when you're in those sorts of rural environments. Because you're not in a city, you don't have the normal ways of kind of expressing yourself. You know, it's the same reason as kind of growing up, I was always very attracted to the kids that were kind of seen as like bad kids. And the reason I think I was attracted to them is because at a very young age they had a very kind of rich interior world. There was kind of nothing to do with their families and nothing to do with kind of education. There was something else, they already had this other idea of kind of expression. And they always seemed to me so much more mature than the other kids. The other kids who kind of had very well functioning homes or something like that, they just wanted to kind of get on at school. They wanted to do what was kind of expected of them, what was going to give them this feeling from their families that they were kind of good kids. Whereas these other kids had to find another way of getting kind of self-esteem, or another way of getting kind of, how do you get to the highest hierarchy that you can in kind of your group? You know, how do you kind of have respect that can then kind of give you self-esteem? And those were really, really attractive kind of qualities, you know, and Better Things kind of touches upon that. And Sunday then touches upon those things in a very different way. I think it's very interesting how kind of one project then kind of leads on to another. And I think part of that is to do with you normally discover something kind of aesthetically in the project that you've just done that you're very happy with, something that you've kind of pushed kind of the boundaries of it in terms of how far you've taken it before. And a lot of those times I would find, that's the thing I'm interested in. And for me with Better Things, it was something to do with kind of the hyper-reality. You know, certain scenes where I felt like I got close to this kind of atmosphere. And then that makes you realise that it's like, okay, I want to go off and do another project which kind of extends that and allows me to kind of investigate that even further. But also it's where in a project that you think, I couldn't take that as far as I wanted to, you know, and in Better Things, I couldn't take things as far as I wanted in certain areas because it's a feature film. And I've got to kind of go along with certain rules of kind of dramaturgy of what an audience needs, including myself, to remain interested when I'm watching a film. But if I turn that down, you know, if I make a 5-minute film, you know, if I make kind of, you know, a 1-minute film, and if I put it into kind of a gallery, then all of a sudden the contract is very, very different. You know, the contract on a cinema screen for 90 minutes with the audience is one thing. You know, the contract is you come to the cinema and I say, okay, I'm going to hold your attention for 90 minutes, you know. Whereas in a gallery, you don't have that contract. You know, it's really kind of liberating. So you can say, okay, you can come in and watch a minute of this, and then you can leave, go to another room, then come back, maybe you see a different minute of it, which is then interesting enough for you to watch the whole thing. I find that's how I kind of interact with kind of artists in a gallery. So I find like I need kind of the two spaces. That doesn't really answer your question about what it was like growing up there. Boring. Boring but interesting.
And were you heading to some kind of transcendence with this piece?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's always a thing, if I look back as to why I got interested in art, why I was kind of like an 8-year-old, and I found something interesting in certain films, or I found something interesting in certain paintings, or I'd go around to a friend's house and maybe his dad had some books or his mom had some books on photography and I was looking through those. I can now backtrack that and see that I was interested in some idea of what they referred to as kind of the sublime. You know, this idea of kind of this philosophical idea that within an image you can contain something which is attempting to go outside of just what we kind of know. And I think for me that's the most interesting thing about cinema, and I think cinema is often kind of referred to as being something to do with literature or something to do with, you know, in terms of the script, or something to do with theatre in terms of kind of the acting, or photography because of kind of the cinematography. But I find there's an element of film which really gets overlooked where it has a very similar element to kind of music. So when I'm listening to music, I'm not analysing in any way, you know, I'm just being pulled along by this other thing. And I find very few films, either in kind of the gallery or in kind of the cinema space, which attempt to kind of do that. And for me, that's one of the most interesting things of it, that you can really build atmosphere, you know, but it's an atmosphere that you could never experience in kind of real life, you know, because you can't edit. You can't completely control what sounds you're hearing and what sounds you're not hearing. So that, for example, the reason I have kind of the 3 screens is because if I have it as a single screen, it instantly collapses in on itself. It becomes more boring because it's linear. But as soon as I have 3 and I stagger the image, then I've got rhythm. Then I've got kind of this repetition. And I think when I'm watching it, I notice that I'm dropping into the repetition in the same way as you would in kind of music. So you can play with kind of the musicality of it in that way.
And Better Things were an attempt to do some multi-narrative film also, so there is this element in it as well.
Yeah, I mean with Better Things that was because, I mean I guess kind of the practical, I always knew that I wanted to direct, and I knew from kind of my early 20s that that's what I wanted to do. And then I went to film school, and film school was like really bad. You know, it was just, I felt like I was being taught by kind of failed filmmakers who were kind of still discussing film in this way which felt really antiquated. you know, it just wasn't modern in any way. And so I wasn't allowed to direct for the whole time that I was there until I was in my final year, and then I directed something which was about the preparation of getting ready for a Friday night. So getting ready for a Friday night with your friends when you're in your early 20s, and you know, one person has to go and score the drugs, and then everyone else comes around your house and you begin to take the drugs and you get ready for the night out, and then you kind of go out. So that's what that film was about, and it kind of did well enough that other people were interested in giving me the money to kind of make the short film. So at that point, I knew that I wanted to tell my own stories. I knew that I wanted to go back to the area that I kind of grew up in and talk about what it was like to kind of grow up in that area. And I felt like I was always seeing films about kind of urban areas in the UK, mostly kind of quite social realist. And I hadn't seen anything which kind of depicted what it was kind of like to grow up as kind of a modern kid in a rural area. And in the area that I grew up in, it really kind of happened just after I left. But heroin and crack got really, really big around the kind of area that I grew up in. So there was like a load of villages that, and it was more with like my younger brother's generation. So every time I'd come back from film school, I'd find out like another one of his friends was dead through heroin use, or another kid that I kind of half knew that was part of another group of kids had kind of died. So I got really interested in this phenomenon of kind of heroin use in a rural place, because we've all seen depictions of kind of heroin use, but it's normally within a film like kind of Christine F. or something like that, where it's also to do with prostitution, it's also to do with like rundown kind of urban areas. But all these kids who were taking heroin and were dying were all kind of nice middle-class kids. You know, it's just that they were really bored, they discovered this drug, and then they kind of got too into it, got addicted, and died. And so I started doing interviews with like the kids who were still kind of taking it, and it was really interesting because there was kind of this, there was something that they were kind of saying and kind of why they were taking it, which I hadn't kind of assumed before. And the one kid that I was interviewing, really, really smart kid, really kind of clued in, you know, in terms of that he could really analyze why he was taking it. And he said this thing which really resonated with me, and he said, well, the thing is, he said, I like being a junkie. And he said, the reason I like being a junkie is because heroin to me is like a confidant. He said, it's something I completely understand. He said, so if I get up in the morning, I know that all I've got to do is get this fix, and I'm going to feel this exact way. So what he's really saying is about kind of equilibrium. What he's really saying is about like a sustainable form of happiness. And I thought to myself, well, that's quite similar to a relationship and kind of why you have a relationship. So all of a sudden then I had the concept that basically I could take kind of drug use and put that against relationships and kind of say, is there that much of a difference?
So this might mean that you start from some social issue, let's say, but we have seen Cigarette at Night where you start from some atmosphere or some certain images, so it has to meet somewhere in the middle, or for a different project you start from a different point?
Yeah, I mean, I've written kind of, I'm in the middle of writing my third kind of feature film, and each one has been written very, very differently. I mean, with Better Things, for example, so I had this idea of kind of, okay, what happens if you, juxtaposition-wise, you put heroin by kind of these relationships. So then I've got the problem of, okay, well, I don't want to do that just kind of normally, you know, to come up with kind of one narrative which kind of encompasses all those things just isn't going to work. You know, it's going to feel really kind of contrived. So really what I'm dealing with is kind of a theme. So how do I make a film which is really just about theme? So I kind of did this experiment of where basically I wrote, I don't know, it was maybe like 200, 250 scenes, which are completely unrelated. You know, they're just scenes that I'm interested in, either in terms of that they're images that I kind of want to make, that I'm interested in kind of creating and filming, or character-wise, or any of those things. And then I went back through all of the scenes to see if there was kind of certain repeated motifs or kind of ideas, you know, so I'm almost kind of looking for my own obsessions. And I kind of found that there was this kind of very thin narrative line, which was more to do with the themes. So then I took those kind of 60 scenes, which I felt kind of spoke to one another, and began to arrange them kind of side by side. And then saw, okay, well, if I take these two characters and make them heroin users, you know, and if I take these two kind of older characters and I make them a couple, you know, and if I take these two younger characters and I make it that they're just discovering kind of young love. So then I started to work on that, and slowly but surely you find a way that if I come out of this scene here and then come into this scene here, all of a sudden they're actually commenting on one another, and there's some kind of thematic kind of resonance. And I think when we were editing the film, what was interesting is that for the first 15 minutes of the film, as an audience, you're kind of wondering, well, why am I watching these disparate characters? You know, they're not kind of adding up to anything. But then by the time you get into like 20, 25 minutes in, you see that the different stories are beginning to kind of comment on one another. And then by the time you get to kind of the last 10 minutes, they've built up into quite this kind of small little whirlwind of how they're kind of having a dialogue about different things, about the idea of what it is to kind of be in love, of what it is to kind of be an addict, you know, and how reliant you are on things, you know, because essentially there was almost no difference between, you know, we have these two older characters who are in their 70s, and the film starts with Better Things, that he comes out from hospital, and then you see that there's a problem in the relationship, and then later on you see that kind of she's obviously transgressed in some way on the marriage, on kind of the relationship at some point in their kind of history. And now it's kind of coming back to him as a problem, as they're kind of in their final kind of years of a marriage. And I thought, well, he's an addict. You know, he's kind of addicted to kind of what this woman kind of gives him, and now he feels that somehow it's kind of sullied, somehow it's not kind of pure anymore. And of course, when you cut from that to the kid who actually is an addict, who lost his girlfriend through an overdose, those things really start to have quite a complex dialogue, in a way which isn't kind of, you know, dramatically cheap, in that you're doing these contrived scenes. So it was almost a way that allowed me to remove every single scene within a film that I'm not interested in. And I think quite often when you're watching a linear film, maybe 70% of the scenes are really interesting, but there's always 30% of the scenes which are really just there to make the narrative work, you know? And with this type of storytelling, I didn't have to do that. I could remove all of those, which was great.
And to underline this, you've decided to film the characters in the nearly exactly the same positions, like lying on the bed and so on. So underlining this by using the visual comparisons between the characters.
Yeah, you mean in Better Things?
Yes, Better Things.
Yeah, I mean that was kind of necessary because it felt like, I mean with Bypass it's all handheld, and in the short films I did a lot of handheld work as well. But when we were prepping for Better Things, the thing I was worried about, and the financiers were definitely worried about, was, is this disparate group of stories, when you film them and you edit it together, are they actually going to talk to one another? Are they actually kind of going to make sense? Are, like, cinematographically, are they going to build up into kind of an emotion in the audience? And I thought, if I do something formally, like shoot it in handheld, which has too much kind of energy behind it, then I don't think it's going to work. I have to really kind of pull back and do something which is kind of a lot more static, because then I think it becomes more about the theme and how the things talk to each other. But if I'm too kind of front and center with kind of the style of it, then I don't think it will really work. But also I was really interested in, like we didn't reference any filmmakers or films, me and the DOP, when we were talking about it. It was all kind of like painting. It was all like Flemish painting and a lot of romantic painters like Millet. And you know, that's where compositionally I was kind of interested at that point.
Okay, this is quite important to hear, I would say. And now maybe let's switch to choosing actors, because you've repeatedly worked with young actors, non-actors, or people for the first time in front of camera. So how is this for you? How do you work with actors who probably are afraid, maybe, being in front of camera?
Yeah,
so
some of them.
How to cope with them?
Well, that kind of grew from, again, you know, when I started making my own short films and I had to kind of build up my own aesthetic and my own kind of methods and processes. You know, the first short film that I did in that way was called Field, which is a story which is about these three kids who hang out together in a village, and they're three kids who really hang out together out of kind of necessity, because there's no one else to kind of hang out with. It's not because they necessarily share kind of interests. And I knew that I wasn't going to find the kids that I was interested in filming or that I was going to believe, because these kids were kind of 14, 15 years old. I knew I wasn't going to find them in kind of acting classes. You know, I wasn't, you know, any kid who by 14 already knows that he wants to be an actor is probably someone who isn't then doing enough things outside of that experience for him to have the same sort of interior world as I wanted these kind of characters to have. So I had to, that necessitated that I had to work with non-actors. You know, I didn't really kind of have a choice. So the way that I did that is that within a 30-mile radius of kind of where we were going to shoot, research kind of all the schools. And then I very purposefully looked into the schools that were having the worst results academically. And then I found this one school where basically all the kids who got expelled from the other schools would go to this school. So I went to that school and I immediately found my three characters very, very quickly. But then of course you've got to find a way of working with them. So how do you kind of do it? Well, the three characters are quite different. So the one guy who's kind of the leader of the group, himself as a character was quite gregarious. You know, he was kind of 14, extremely confident. So I would go out with him and his group of friends, and I would kind of observe how he was with that group. And he was an arch kind of manipulator, you know, so he could really, because everyone else in the group wanted his approval, he could get all these kids to do things where he didn't want to do them, but he wanted to watch someone else kind of do it, and they would kind of do it because he kind of asked them to. So because he was like that, I knew that I could be very honest with him, because the other two kids that I cast were kind of looking up to him. So in a way, I had to get him to kind of get them to do the things, you know? So I'm kind of directing the other kids through him. So that was the one way of kind of doing it. And that really worked for the other kid, because the kid who's kind of in the middle very much wants the approval of this other kid. So depending on how I want him to be, I either address this kid personally or I go through this other kid. And then the kid who's kind of the bullied of the group, if you like, and is kind of like the conscience of kind of the film, he was really interesting because he was completely and utterly undirectable, and that's kind of why I cast him. He was at an age and he had a certain mentality where he's extremely uncomfortable in his own skin, in his own body. So he's at that point of adolescence where he's all jerky movements. You know, he can't quite control what his body's doing. So at the end of the film, after they've done this one act, which is quite an extreme act, you know, you've seen the film, I need him to look guilty. I need him to look as though he's having kind of like a crisis of conscience in this assembly at school at the end. Well, I can't say to him, okay, can you look guilty? Can you imagine this and film it? Because what I get is going to be terrible. So by that point, I've been working with him for about 3 or 4 days. So I have an idea as to what he's going to react to physically and what not. So first of all, we're filming it, and it's in a school assembly, so there's like 200 kids. So I make sure he's sat at the front. So there's like 200 kids sat behind him. So he's already feeling that kind of intensity, you know, of the whole school kind of looking at him. Then I put a wide angle lens on the camera, so the camera's very close to him, only about this far away. So we're all working very, very close to him. So he's getting more kind of nervous because of that. And then I took a piece of tape and put a cross right in front of him. And I was quite kind of harsh with him, and I just said, look, okay, we're just doing this shot, it's just a close-up of your face, right? Just look at this tape, okay? Just look at this tape, but keep your eyes on this fucking tape. Because if you move your eyes, I can't use the shot. Okay, so you've got to just keep your eyes there, don't fucking move. And then I come back, and I wait before I tell him to turn over, and I can see, he's staring at this tape. And then after, 30 seconds or so, his eyes start going. And then he starts kind of moving, and then he's shifting in his seat. So he's starting to look guilty. Okay, start turning. So then I film him for like 5 minutes, and it's very easy to find 5 seconds of that.
It seems that you studied psychology when talking about this. But basically, you meet the guys, so you see how they look like,
yeah.
Then you are searching for some life experience.
Yeah.
And then the acting abilities come at the third place, we could say, right?
Well, you've got to find something close, but I think there's another problem with it. It kind of all depends. Some non-actors have the ability to become actors. So as you work with them, you start to realize that it's like, okay, this person can actually really interiorize what I'm saying and pull it back out again. They actually have that kind of ability to be able to do it. Other non-actors will start to believe that they're an actor, and then they will start to over-emote. They'll start to go over the top, and then you have to kind of pull that back. So you're constantly trying to figure out kind of what is working and what is not. And I think there's a thing that kind of actors kind of discuss about kind of camera awareness. And when you work with actors, it's very clear that some actors are very aware of kind of the camera. So they start to have this beautiful dynamic between them and the character. And if you've got a good camera operator and a good actor, the almost kind of dance that they begin to do is really kind of quite beautiful. But with a non-actor, you don't have that. They're not kind of spatially aware. So what you have is you have to figure out how to use the camera as kind of like a microscope to film these things. And I think the story that I just mentioned about the cross is kind of a good example of that. That basically I'm just trying to get him into kind of a space where he's really physically, emotionally and psychologically experiencing something which is going to give me visually a very similar thing to what I kind of need. And when I edit that from that image to that image, that's going to give the meaning that I kind of want. But there's loads of different ways that you can work with it. For example, in Better Things, there's, I don't know if you remember, but there's a scene where a girl has just been with this guy in the barn, and they've just had some sexual experience. And then he goes off on the bike, and she has to walk across this muddy field. And I wanted to do it in a single Steadicam take. And as she's walking across this field, she has to go from being quite normal and quite in control of her emotions to breaking down as she walks across the field. So that's a very hard thing for kind of a non-actor to do, to be able to do that over kind of a 1 minute, 1.5 minute kind of shot. But the girl that I'd cast, I'd met her on an estate, and while I was street casting, she walked past me. And she walked past me, and it was like a windy day, and she was crying, and she was trying to light this cigarette as she was walking. And immediately I kind of saw and was kind of struck, because it also kind of starts with that you see someone and you just think, okay, I've got to stop them and have a conversation for like 2 minutes. And while I'm talking to them, what I'm really thinking is, do I want to photograph this person? Am I interested in kind of training a camera on them? So I stopped her and we had kind of a quick conversation, and I explained what I was doing and everything. And of course, I don't ask her why she's crying. That would have been too much at that point. So when I go and meet her a few weeks later to kind of do some interviews and find out more about her, I find out that she was just coming back from court, where her boyfriend had just been sent to jail for like 6 months for a load of, he'd stolen a lot of cars and been caught, and he was getting 6 months anyway. So, so just as we're about to shoot that scene, like 4 months later, they're setting up the Steadicam and we're getting ready for the shot and the crew are doing their thing. And I take it to the side and I say, right, okay, we need to do the shot, you know? Let's just have a conversation. You know, let's try and get you ready for kind of the shot. And I said, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk about your boyfriend. She said, yeah, sure, okay. And I said, okay, tell me when you first met him. So she tells me when they first met. And I said, okay, tell me how you kind of got together. And she explained it. And I said, okay, explain to me when you first kissed each other. And then I said, okay, explain to me when you realized that you were in love with him. And then, okay, now explain to me what it was like in that courtroom and watching him get sent down. And then she starts to kind of well up. And I'm like, okay, now let's go and do the shot. So you're just trying to get them into that space of where they're about to kind of relive something and you're going to film it, you know? And then afterwards you thank them a lot.
And is there any receipt for like kind of art of the conversation? Where do you start? Like I can imagine that I watch people on the street and some of them seem interesting to me, but I cannot really imagine that I start a conversation with them, that I would like to cast them or photograph them. How to do it?
It's kind of a weird thing, but it's actually strangely really enjoyable because you know that you're kind of transgressing the rules of normal conversation.
Right.
So there's something really interesting in that. And I think most people are extremely kind of open to it, but I always kind of lie. So I never say that I'm a director. As soon as you say that you're a film director, they want to ask a load of other questions. So I always say that I'm a casting director. So anything they ask about the film or anything they ask about anything like that, I can just straight bat it. And I can just say, wow, I don't really know that, you know. But you'll probably be able to find it out if you meet with the director, you know. But so you just have to kind of approach them and you just kind of say, okay, look, this is going to sound really weird, but I'm a casting director, okay? This is what I do kind of professionally. I specialize in kind of casting non-actors. I get used for this all the time, and then I'll say that I've cast this or this or this, which may or may not be something that they've kind of heard of. And then I'll normally reference a few films that they kind of know and say, well, you know, that was kind of casted by non-actors and that was done by another casting director that I know. You know, and then you always just have a card and you just say, okay, you know, do you mind if I take your phone number? Sometimes they don't want it. And then you say, okay, here's a card, you know what I mean? You can kind of Google about kind of this filmmaker so you can see that it's all legit, you can see that it's all real. If it's interesting for you, give me a call and we'll arrange an interview, you know? And then once you've got the interview, you can go there, you can do the photographs, you can film something, you can really start to understand what sort of ingredient this person kind of could or could not be, really. But it's a really interesting thing to do, and you also get into a lot of scenarios and situations which are, you know, I think as you get older, your kind of your sphere of experience becomes narrower. You know, if you think about when you're at school, you meet a lot of other people. Maybe you go to university, you meet a lot of other people. You know, once all of that finishes, you have a job, you have a group of friends. You can almost feel it kind of narrowing the sphere of experience that you kind of have. This is one of those things that completely opens it up again. So it's really interesting. And you know, and curious things happen. Like, you know, you end up getting threatened, or you end up getting, you know, depending on the type of people that you go and talk to. You know, because there's been situations where I've gone into kind of groups of kids, and I've thought to myself, okay, this isn't going so well. I think I've got to try and get out of this. There was one time, this one guy who I still think about because I would have loved to have filmed him. I approached him on a really dodgy estate, and he was like, no, not interested. So then he went into a bookies, And I walked off and I was thinking, okay, I just got to leave that. And I was thinking, but I just got to give him another chance. Went into the bookies and he was like, fucking told you, I'm not interested. So I went outside and I thought, right, I'm just going to leave it. And then I thought, I'm just going to wait until he comes out. And then he kind of came out, and before I'd even said anything, he was like, you fuck off. So it's like, at that point I thought, yeah, forget about him. He might be hard to work with.
Bypass is a bit different story. The main character is casted by a professional, and you worked for quite a big amount of time in the pre-production, right?
There was a huge amount of research to do, because it was about, I'm from a working class family, and when I decided to make Bypass and I was going back into these communities, I realized that kind of the communities had just changed kind of drastically from what they were when I kind of grew up. Working class for me was about a very kind of tight-knit community that had a real kind of social world and a real kind of intellectual world. I remember growing up being 10 or something like that, and my dad would take me to the pub because my dad would go to the pub every Saturday and Sunday kind of afternoon, and I would go there with him, and the place would be full. The place would be absolutely packed with him and all his friends, and there would be, I overhear these fantastic kind of debates and discussions which were to do with sport, politics, art, all these kind of different things, and there would be, all of their kids would be there, so we'd all kind of hang out and kind of do our thing. And when I went back to these areas, most of these pubs were shut down. They weren't there anymore. And of course, these were kind of lifebloods of kind of the community. Whereas 50 years before that might have been the church, now it was kind of the pub, and especially the working men's club, which was normally associated with one of the big kind of manufacturing firms or something like that. But when the manufacturing firms disappeared, so did these pubs, so did these places of where they'd all kind of go and meet. So you ended up, by that point, being at least one generation, if not two generations deep of kind of unemployment, and these kids really had nothing to do. And because kids being kids, they're going to find a way of experimenting, they're going to find a way of learning, they're going to find a way of kind of inventing danger in a way, of how they kind of test themselves and how they kind of build their personalities. And I realized going back there that I was very, very interested in the characters I met, extremely interested in them. But I needed to really research every kind of aspect of their lives, including all the illegal aspects, to do with kind of gangs, car theft. I didn't understand anything about car theft, and how you kind of practically do it, and how you get out of, if you get into a chase with the police, what you do. But you meet these guys that do it almost kind of professionally, and you realize these are professionals. They really, really know what they're doing. So there was a lot of research. I think we researched for about a year, something like that.
And then you started to work with the main actor, and you developed the character. You even changed him physically a bit, right?
Yeah, because I knew after Better Things that I felt like I'd taken, I'd done 2 short films and a feature film working with this method of like exclusively with kind of non-actors. And I felt like I was now beginning to feel the kind of limitations of kind of what you could get from kind of a non-actor, and how I was having to make up for that with camera, or what I kind of did in the edit. Because when you work with a non-actor, there's a lot of kind of provocation, but it probably means that maybe as much as like 30% of your rushes aren't really usable, because of some kind of mistake that they've made during the take, or you don't quite believe kind of the performance. So I was rewatching a lot of Alan Clark at that point, who is a fantastic UK director who was really kind of underrated and was making films in mainly kind of 80s and 90s. But he discovered actors like Gary Oldman and Tim Roth and Ray Winstone. And I started to get very fascinated by, we've always kind of had a strong talent pool in the UK, of kind of actors. And we very much have a strong talent pool of kind of undiscovered actors as well, who are kind of coming up. And I thought the kind of thing that we set ourselves was, okay, we don't want to use faces that we've already seen before, we want new faces. So how do we discover what we think is kind of some of the next generation of these really kind of talented actors? And George Mackay actually came in to the audition process very, very early, and I saw his tape and was very, very interested in him. And I still saw a lot of other people after that. But I met up with George and we did another kind of 2 auditions, and I was pretty convinced that he could do, I was convinced first of all that he could do the role, and also I was really impressed by him as a person, because I think whenever I decide to work with a non-actor, that's partly is to do with that I want to spend time with this person, that I find them interesting for a load of other reasons. I find them interesting photographically, but also I find their personality interesting, so I want to hang around with them. And I discovered something was very, very similar with George, but George's upbringing had been very, very different to the upbringing that Tim as a character would have had. So we had to find a way of how we could remove George, if you like, and just be kind of left with Tim. So the first set of kind of conversations was to do with, okay, can we get you psychologically to a point of where you can almost imagine that you're existing in kind of a parallel universe? You're still you still have the same morality, because actually George's morality and Tim's morality is actually very similar as kind of people, But how do we get you to a point where you've had none of the opportunities that you've had and you don't feel that you've actually had them? And the more we discussed it, the more that was about, okay, how do we make it so that when you look in the mirror and you see yourself and you know, okay, this is me, how do we make it that there's some kind of disconnect, that something doesn't quite fit with kind of what you're seeing? And then the very obvious way of doing that, apart from wardrobe and everything else, was that he needed to lose a lot of weight. So he lost about 15 kilos, I think, to do the film. And every time that took about 3.5 months, I think, for him to do that. And every time I saw him, he was getting thinner and thinner and thinner. Until finally what you looked at when you saw him was someone completely different. He was unrecognizable from how he normally looked. And for the whole of the film that we were shooting for, I really don't feel like I was dealing with George, I was dealing with Tim. He completely kind of disappeared into this other character. And I think he really enjoyed that, because he's very, very much about the craft and how he gets to that performance. And I think after a week of shooting, he'd really kind of disappeared into kind of this other person, which made the actual performance for him a lot easier. When we did the scene of him having the seizure, that was quite something else. Because I think that was almost kind of cathartic for him, because he built up such a steam of kind of doing the performance, and it was so hard for him to kind of lose that weight.
Okay, this was about actors,
Mm-hmm.
and now let's open another chapter about editing mainly, and let's open it with your short film 12th Man, which is on a very different theme, but it's a very good introduction to the theme. Editing. Newcastle versus Sunderland.
Yeah, it's always like that is from like one game, so yeah.
Are you a football fan?
Yeah, kind of. Apparently my dad used to tell me that he used to take me to Molyneux, which is Wolves' home ground, when I was a kid, but I don't remember it. But when I moved to Newcastle, it's like a religion up there. So it's crazy. Newcastle are not doing so well now, but when they were kind of competing for kind of the title back in kind of the early 90s, it was literally like, depending on what the result was on a Saturday, that would dictate what the atmosphere was like in town. If they'd had a bad loss, it was like, okay, I'm not going to town tonight. If they've won, it's like, I really want to go into town because it's going to be buzzing. So it's like, it's really strange it has that much of an effect on people. You know.
Very dynamic films, many cameras, many camera operators.
Yeah.
How did you develop this film? How did you edit so many footage into this piece? So many gestures and so many like faces with many emotions.
It came from kind of a friend of mine kind of saying, offering me to kind of do it, and at the time I was editing Bypass, and I didn't think I could do it. And his thing was he was putting together this group of kind of like one director from each country, and kind of it just had to be a film about football. That's all it had to be. And he said, look, here's the budget, you can do whatever you want, you know. You don't even have to clear it with me, you have complete kind of, you can do whatever you kind of want, you just deliver the film, and I promise you I'll just put it out with the other films. There won't be any kind of editorial control. And that was kind of too much of a good thing to kind of not do. And then I realized that, first of all, he told me that a lot of the other directors were doing something about kind of the unity of football. And I thought, okay, well, we can do something which is kind of similar, but maybe a bit of a different take on that. And then I realised that kind of the Sunderland-Newcastle derby was coming up in like a month's time. So there was a very quick turnaround. I had to have the film delivered, I think, in kind of 8 weeks or something like that. So it was like, okay, what we can do is, and it, you know, it always kicks off like that at a derby, you know, and it really it can be any kind of derby. You know what I mean? If you have a derby between kind of two big football teams, there's a lot of aggression between those two teams, you know, the two sets of supporters. And I knew that it was going to be similar to that because I'd kind of been to derbies before. The problem was exactly, it's like, how do you film it? How do you kind of, you know, how do you kind of get that footage? So we had, I think we had 12 different filmers. And what happens is, same as everywhere else, you know, when the visiting supporters arrive, there'll be a load of police at the train station. And then basically those police will be escorting those groups of supporters all the way up to the ground, you know, because they've got to keep the two sets of supporters apart. You know, they can't let them get together. And of course, as you get closer to the ground, there's more and more of kind of the home supporters and more kind of police, and it gets more and more aggressive. And then the great thing is that then you go, once you're through the ticket stores, you're then underground, you know, and it becomes almost gladiatorial, you know, before they kind of go into the ground. So how do we kind of film all these things? So we took the 12 filmers and basically dotted them along the kind of course that they were going to kind of take. And each person was basically told, okay, shoot on kind of this lens, you know, be in the middle of the action as much as you can. And the thing that I was concerned about was whether or not basically someone there with a camera was going to get into trouble. You know, like you're with kind of all the supporters, you're in the middle of it, and I knew that with the piece, it was either going to work or not work, depending on how much you were actually in kind of the moment. Because the idea was like, okay, I don't want to film it kind of objectively, I want to film it like you're actually in it. You know, like you're actually experiencing it. I think when you watch the film, you can feel your kind of heart rate kind of going up. You kind of get pulled along with the action in the same way as the supporters do. You can kind of understand in a way why they begin to kind of become animal. So that was kind of a concern. So everyone was kind of told, you know, if someone starts asking you what you're doing or getting aggressive because they're going to be quite up, the adrenaline's really going to be going, then stop filming. But nobody had that problem. You know what I mean? If anything, I don't think they were playing up for kind of the camera, but they had no problem with being recorded. You know, none kind of whatsoever, which is interesting of itself, I think. But yeah, so we filmed it, and I really had no idea kind of what we had because I can't really direct that. You know, my directing kind of finishes once I kind of say, okay, shoot on this lens, be here, you know what I mean, this is kind of what you're looking for, this is what I need to kind of make it work. So really prioritize getting that material, you know, always look for kind of those things. So then it was about going through the rushes and kind of picking out the pieces which I thought were interesting, which is the same as you do with any sets of brushes. You know, you'll sit with your editor, go through it and say, okay, I like that take, I don't like that take. Okay, pull out that piece and put it with that lot over there because I think it speaks to that piece. And then we cut it all up into geographically the movement of kind of thing. And then the first cut was very kind of messy and I think was about 15 minutes long. But you instantly saw that there was this dynamic, and the dynamic was that basically the film starts and it's civilization. You know, it's people being civilized and as they kind of normally are. And then as the film progresses, you basically strip away all of the kind of socialization. And so you're left with something which is extremely tribal, you know, which is to do with kind of colors and identity and place. You know, this is where I live, this is my team, you live somewhere else, that's your team, we're enemies. You know, and in the middle of that, you have kind of the state. You have kind of the police who are just trying to kind of stop it. So you could see kind of what, you know, in terms of sociology, the kind of, and anthropology, the kind of themes were that you could kind of play with. Then it was about finding an editing style which meant that you were constantly relating these things. So if you were to actually go through the film and break it down, you'd see that we never go more than 3 cuts with either the police or one team or the other team. So we're always kind of going back and forth. So you've constantly got this triangle effect of where you're bouncing between these things kind of the whole time. And that was basically what we kind of stuck to. And then what I wanted to do was to, you know, you were speaking earlier on about kind of transcendence. I was trying to do that. I was trying to get the edit to a point of where it transcends anything to do with kind of right or wrong or anything like that. It's almost like this transcendent kind of form of energy. Because when you're there and you're actually kind of watching it, you know, you're watching guys who have got families. You know, you're watching guys who throughout the week are very responsible kind of family guys and they have jobs and everything else. Come the weekend and they're 5 or 6 drinks in the afternoon and they're off to go and watch their team. I mean, they just lose it. You know, so there's this whole other identity. But at the same time, there's this interesting thing about kind of identity and masculinity, which is kind of going on.
Is sound editing in this kind of film an easy thing?
In some ways it is. It's very easy to do like the 10-second sequences. You know, to do like 10 seconds of it and to do another 10 seconds and another 10 seconds is quite simple. Because you're just trying to find the dynamic of kind of the juxtaposition. And that's, again, it comes back to the idea of there being kind of a musicality to what you're doing. You know, you're trying to hit these high points and come down and then hit it again and come down and go up again. So doing those is quite straightforward, but actually making then those 10 sequences really lock together into a narrative is kind of much harder. You know, you have to have something which is kind of more conceptual, which is to do with this idea of, okay, you know, only 3 cuts, then you go back and forth, and always with kind of the cuts, you know, I'd go into the edit and I'd say, okay, you're 15 seconds too late before we go into the next movement, which has to go up again. So it's about kind of constantly trying to remove the fat of it, because you never want the audience to be at a point where it feels as though they're seeing something that they've already seen. You know, it's like, okay, I've already experienced that. You know, you want it to keep raising and raising and raising. And it's trying to get the balance of like how much time you need to be able to express that moment. Is that 10 seconds? Is it 15? Is it 30? You know. But that's just kind of rhythm and pace, I think.
For your feature films, especially for Bypass, do you use storyboards? Do you script basically editing from the very beginning?
I used to do storyboards with Field and with Love Me. I did storyboards. Everything was storyboarded actually. field was really interesting because I think literally 90% of the film is like storyboards. You know, if you put the storyboards by the film, it would literally be almost cut by cut for like 90% of it. Bypass, I didn't storyboard anything. I just went through the script, and by that point I felt comfortable enough that I could just do like a shot list. So I would go to the location, you know, figure out roughly how the scene was going to be blocked, you know, without the actors, and go there with the DOP and say, okay, in terms of kind of lighting and everything like that, because, you know, something like 12th Man obviously isn't lit in any way, shape or form, but, you know, Bypass, everything is kind of lit, and you've got to take that into consideration, you know, because you've only got a certain amount of time to shoot the scene. And if there's 12 setups that I want, I can't move the lights every time I change the setup. I don't have the time to do it. So then the discussion is it's like, okay, I'm thinking about shooting it this way, and I'm thinking there's going to be maybe 10 setups. So we'll be looking this way, then over here, then from there. What problems does that give me in terms of the lighting? You know, how much time am I going to lose with you kind of lighting it in between those shots? And then the DOP will say, okay, you know, these 6 shots, no problem, you know, but these ones, if you really want them, then I'm going to have to move the lights over to here. Or so I think when you do the storyboards, it can almost be a little bit too, you know, you're kind of working from an ivory tower. You know, you're not taking into consideration the practical issues.
You've repeatedly used several tricks in editing room to build the space in a very specific way, breaking the 180 degree rule, or very short flashbacks, flash forwards, things like that. Can you talk a little bit, can you elaborate a little bit on creating the space by editing, and especially by using these like different angles and so on?
It's kind of hard to, because that's in a way that's really about, that's so intuitive and so kind of emotional as to kind of why I do that I really can't explain about why I kind of use space in that way. I mean, in terms of the 180 cuts, I was really interested in that because I remembered a film teacher telling me that you can't do it. You know, and saying when you can't do that, that kind of breaks a rule. And it was like, yeah, but it feels really good. When you put that cut by that cut, it's like bang, I feel that, you know. And so that was about making, I can remember when I showed, there's a scene in Better Things where I shoot the whole scene like that. And I use profiles as well to get around the problem of cutting over like 180. And I can remember when I showed it to the financiers, and they really liked it. And it was such a risk to kind of shoot it in that way as to whether or not it was going to kind of work. But I'd done something similar on the short, so I kind of knew that it probably would. But it also comes from, you know, a filmmaker called Ozu. Yeah, well, Ozu does it. You know, he does it kind of a lot. You know, in terms of like any Ozu film that you watch, any conversation is actually like a direct address to kind of camera. And I always loved that, you know, I always really kind of felt it. But another reason for it, I think, in using that kind of space is a lot of films that I watch, they try and like hide the editing. You know, it's like, well, the audience shouldn't be aware of kind of the editing. And it's like, well, it's not theatre. You know, I'm not trying to make it like one long piece. You know, to me, editing is the thing which is, it's completely unique to film. It's like we were mentioning earlier on, you know, cinematography is photography, you know, the script is literature, acting is theatre. They're all these stolen things from other art forms. But editing is completely unique. The only other thing which has got it is music, in terms of like hip hop and cut and paste, you know. But this is different because it's visual. So it's the one thing that when you go to a cinema, it's unique to the cinema. Nothing else can kind of give you that. So for me to kind of underuse that just doesn't make any sense, you know, based upon this idea that I'm not meant to be aware that I'm watching a film, and editing makes me too aware that I'm watching a film. It's like, I know I'm watching a film. You know, what I really want to see is the editing used artistically in a way which makes me make I guess, connections between things, which normally I wouldn't do. You know, that I wouldn't be able. To me, it's quite similar as to when you read a novel. You know, and in a novel, you can really jump from this place to that place. You can really go inside the character or outside the character. I think editing is very, very similar in that way. You know, with all those things that you can do. But also, editing is interesting because, you know, if you're watching theatre, someone falls off a chair. It's like the thing that Podovkin wrote when he was beginning to analyse what editing was, and the same with kind of Eisenstein. You know, they were saying that when you watch someone fall off a chair, if you just watch it in the theatre, they just fall off the chair, that's it. But in editing, I can have a close-up of the foot, which I then see starts to wobble. Then I can cut round to the side and see that their shoulder's dropping. Then I can go to a wide shot as they land on the floor. And all of a sudden you've got this different way of experiencing it, you know, which is nothing else you can do.
I suppose we are not ready yet to show another clip. So one more question about editing. You've also repeatedly used cross-cutting between different spaces, but creating one space, basically feeling of one space out of 2 or 3 different places. Is also some specific feeling behind this for you?
I guess that just extends the idea of what I'm just kind of what we were just kind of saying about kind of, you know, those 3 cuts of someone falling off a chair. That enables you to experience something, you know, temporally and narratively, which you can't do in real life. And I think the idea of going between these spaces is really just an extension of that. You know, for me, you're going very deep into what cinema is really capable of. You know, that for some reason I accept it as just this run of reality when it's completely anything else, you know? And it means that then I can be much more expressive and much more subtle in kind of the connections that I'm making, you know? Whereas if I'm filming a conversation between 2 people and I want there to be a slight subtext of something, so I can either have the line, which has the subtext, or I can rely on the actor's ability to hint at the subtext in the performance, or I can use the editing, that I basically go from this space to that space to then really show the subtext. And that for me is always really interesting, you know. And I think it's also that it's kind of what I react to when I'm watching a film. I can remember the first time I ever saw a director doing it was in Raging Bull. And he would go from like these normal 24 frames a second images into something just a touch slower, and then he would cut to a close-up of a guy watching it, so then you know that you're seeing the POV, and this guy is seeing this thing, and then at the same time in the sound design, he's making it so it sounds distant. So at that point, I'm kind of deep in this character and knowing that he's really reacting to this thing that he's watching. And then he'll kind of go somewhere else with another character. And all of a sudden, I'm really emotionally feeling kind of what those characters are seeing and what they're thinking. And I can remember watching that film and really enjoying that sensation because I hadn't felt that sensation before.
Okay, let's move to the clip which is from Bypass, and it's car chase scene, like 7 or 8 minutes long, so we can discuss it afterwards. From a car chase scene to a very intimate home setting. And you specially asked for showing this clip and talking about the car chase. So I will leave it up to you.
It was very interesting to shoot because I'd never shot anything kind of like that. You know, everything that I'd shot before had been kind of quite quiet and kind of very intimate. And when I did the first draft of the script, I was writing in a way where I wasn't kind of analysing kind of what was happening, you know. So when I wrote Bypass anyway, the first image that I had was Tim as a character in this doctor's waiting room. And I knew that what he was going to find out, we as the audience weren't going to be privy to. And I knew that what he would have just found out was not good news. And I knew that he was going to ignore this news as well. And then I just started scripting the film from there, I didn't kind of know anything more. So when I'd written the car chase, I didn't know that the car chase was going to happen almost until I'd kind of written it. And then it was like, when I read the script back and realised that there was kind of a lot of sort of thriller kind of elements, and it was like, okay, well, how on earth do I kind of do a car chase? You know, you've got to do something which kind of has an energy behind it. You've got to do something which is kind of thrilling and kind of compelling to kind of watch. But how do you do it in a way that budgetary, you know, we're going to be really kind of constrained as to kind of what we can do. And also, how do you do it in a way which has got something else to it? And when I started doing the research for the car chase itself, as to like, okay, how does a car chase actually kind of happen? You know, if you're kind of quite an experienced kind of car thief, then you would have been in kind of races with the cops. So I spoke to a lot of kids who had been caught and maybe done kind of 6 months to a year or whatever for kind of car theft. You know, and these kids were hugely experienced. You know, maybe some of them had had like, you know, stolen like 300 cars or something like that, and been in like 6 races with the police. And I said, well, how do you win that kind of chase? How do you kind of do it? And they said, well, it's kind of quite straightforward. First of all, you've got to make sure that you're racing the police in an area that you know. So as soon as the police are kind of behind you, the first thing you've got to figure out is, are they interested in me? And is the car that I'm in, that I've stolen, already been reported stolen? So the way you do that is you find a couple of roundabouts which are quite close to one another, and you double back on yourself. Basically, if the police are still following you after you've double backed on yourself, then it's like, okay, they've already radioed in to find out about the car, and the car's already been reported. So he said the next thing that's going to happen is the police are going to be radioing through for backup. And what's going to happen is a police car is going to come up the other way and stop you. And then there's going to be a car in front of you and a car behind you. Once that happens, you can't get out of it. You can't win the race. So he said, then very quickly, you've got to start the race, basically. And he said, what you need to do is you need to be in an area that you know very, very well. And you're hoping that they don't know it very well. So any race lines that you take, you already know and they don't know. So you already have the upper hand. He said, the next thing you need to do is to find an open kind of area that you can drive into, which is right by a set of woods. And he said, then what you do is you drive very fast and you ramp over the curb. That's basically going to break the axle of the car, the front axle of the car. Then you'll land, but even though the front axle is broken, you'll still be able to drive the car for probably about 100, 200 meters. That should get you to the woods. And he said, then you get out and you start running. He said, the police won't follow you over the curb. So basically you've got in between a 100 and 200 meter head start on a foot chase with the police. And as long as you've done that quick enough before they've managed to get a helicopter out to you, he said you've got a very good chance of outrunning it. And he said then what you do is you then run to normally an allotment or something like that through the woods. And he said then you'll hide out in one of the huts in the allotment until the next morning, and then you'll go back home. And we actually had a scene that we'd shot of kind of Tim waking up in this allotment and then leaving, but we didn't really need the scene. So once I had that kind of idea, and I knew that I could realistically do a car chase in a way that I hadn't seen in a film before, which was completely practical, where a car thief watching the scene would go, that's right, that's what you do. I thought that's really interesting. You know what I mean? That makes me really interested in kind of going and shooting it. And then because you've got Greg in the car, who is an experienced car thief, and you have Tim, who's not, basically what's got to happen then is Greg has got to explain to his brother what's going to happen. So basically what you've got is almost like a monologue or dialogue scene taking place in the car at the same time as you've got this kind of chase. So actually what you've got is a dialogue scene where they just happen to be being chased by the police and they're trying to escape. And I thought, okay, that makes it so that I can really be interested in this, you know, and that makes it so that I can really believe that kind of conversation. And I can believe that a similar conversation would have gone on between other kids in real life when they're actually having to kind of get out of that scenario. But also shooting it was a hell of a lot of fun as well.
And then comes the flashback.
Yeah.
To the football ground. Both brothers, like more than 10-15 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it made a lot of
sense. Weren't you afraid that you will split the thriller in it, the thrill, and that you will like spoil the scene by using the flashback?
A little bit, but there was something about it which seemed very psychologically true. In this moment of kind of extreme stress for Tim, you know, where he's going into a situation where really he wants to just kind of disappear kind of inside of himself, and he's basically getting the adrenaline of kind of the fight or flight, which is really what Greg's reacting to. You know, Greg knows that his brother is basically on the verge of shutting down, you know, and he's got to motivate his brother to understand once this fucking car stops, you run, you go, you know. So it made a lot of sense to me in that moment that kind of Tim would actually disappear into himself, into a very kind of secure and kind of safe memory, but also a secure and safe memory because that memory almost has a narrative to it. You know, that when he goes in there, he's kind of disappearing because he's in fear. But by the time you finish kind of the memory is actually positive, kind of watching his brother playing, and then he kind of begins to kind of fixate on the father, and then he has to come back into kind of the chase itself and kind of reality. But yeah, I mean, a little bit concerned about it, about whether or not it was going to split that moment. But then I knew that editorially we were going to kind of find a way around it. And of course, in the first kind of few iterations of it, it's kind of a little bit sketchy as to whether or not you're really building up this energy, and then the energy's dissipating, and then you're kind of going back into something else. But I think with this, it works very interestingly, because I almost, as an audience member, I almost like that kind of, I like it when you feel a film is taking you one way, and then it quickly diverges somewhere else, and then kind of comes back to kind of what it was doing with no loss, but just with a greater kind of psychological or kind of emotional intensity to kind of what you're watching. You know, I'm not interested in doing a car chase just for the sake of a car chase. It's got to have another kind of meaning and another context to it, you know. But it's still interesting to do something which has got to give the audience a kind of a sugar rush.
Okay. My last question, before there will be time for questions from the audience, regards Third Films, production company. You are working steadily with one producer, Sam, your regular collaborator and friend, producing your own films, but also films of other directors.
Yeah.
What kind of importance is this collaboration, and like, is it better to have your own company for doing films you are doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's been very organic as to kind of how it's grown. Me and Sam have known each other since film school, and we kind of connected there because we both didn't like it. And we both didn't really like the films and kind of how we were being kind of taught. So we knew when we left that we very much kind of wanted to work together. And Third at the start was basically a vehicle for me to learn the type of directing that I wanted to do, and for him to learn the sort of producing that he wanted to do, you know, because I think we produce films in a very independent way, and there's a few other companies which are kind of similar, you know. I think Borderline Films in the States, you know, we kind of know them, and also there's Platform Production in Sweden with Ruben Östlund and Eric Hemmendorf, and they co-produced Bypass, you know, and there's similarities there in terms of our kind of independence. And we did the short films and we did Better Things, and then without us really knowing it, we were beginning to get a reputation as a company. So at that point we started having other directors approaching us, and we were looking at this material and we thought this is actually quite interesting. And I kind of I was curious about kind of producing myself, you know, about, because the thing about owning your own company, and I think that the thing with kind of platform production, they feel it as well, is that if you're a director and you work very closely with your producer and you have your own company, you kind of control everything. You know, once you've got the money, I'm in control of pretty much everything. So I can sit down with Sam and he shows me the whole budget, you know, line by line, you know, and so if I say to him, okay, look, I really need this one thing, and he's like, can't afford it. I'm like, okay, show me the budget. And then we'll go through it and it's like, okay, I don't need that much money in the art department, or I don't need that much money in the editing department, or the wardrobe here I can do without that one other person, you know, okay, does that buy me the money to go over there? So the jigsaw puzzle that you've got to do with the budget, you're then part of, because I think one of the mistakes that directors make is that they think directing is really just what happens on the set, and it's not. You know, that's basically maybe 60 to 70% of the job is kind of on the set. The rest is kind of behind the scenes. You know, so how are you interacting with the production office? You know, how are you interacting with your producer? How you're dealing with the problems with the budget, because there's always problems with the budget, you know. And I like to be across all of those things and be in control of kind of all of those things. The guys at Platform are very kind of similar, you know, about how they kind of work as director, kind of producer. So it's it's about kind of control.
So, your questions, please.
I want to know, have you ever shown The 12th Man to any Newcastle or Sunderland fans who are like really into the football?
Yeah, they like, I mean, it got really kind of big because it was like when after it had gone off to like this film that it was kind of part of, it then kind of went online, and I know it like went like wildfire through like all the kind of groups of kind of the supporters. You know, mainly I know that because it's like I'll chat to like kind of a Newcastle fan or something like that, and I'll say, have you seen a film called 12th Man? They're like, fuck yes. You know, so you always, you know, of course they've kind of seen it, but it was funny because I started getting emails from people saying, go on this link. And I'd go to the link, we were saying about it kind of the other night, and I'd go on the link and it would be to like some football hooligan site in kind of Poland or something, of where they'd kind of put it up on that. So I think anybody who has kind of an interest on kind of, you know, the kind of game before the game, you know, they're kind of aware of it.
They don't like feel like any regret the way they were acting or anything, or they feel like, oh.
No, I think there was a couple of forum things that people kind of sent to me where like someone on like a Newcastle forum or something like that is saying, oh, if you go to like minute whatever, there's me. You know, I'm kind of doing that. So I think it's kind of the opposite rather than kind of regret. Yeah, I hope no one's been sacked from their jobs for like being in there. I haven't heard about that.
I have a question about better things. It's a bit, because you already explained a little bit about the script and how you kind of got to that moment where you sort of had a theme, as you said, you wanted to talk about. But it, you know, whether you wanted or not, or whether that was your initial goal, it's very visual. And editing plays such an important thing in sound, plus how you formalistically deal with the space, which I really liked. I really liked how you communicated through, you know, how you positioned the actors and you were moving from one shot to another, or from scene or character, and you were putting them almost in a similar, you know, position in the frame, but it was a totally different character. So, because I usually have a problem as well with that, of how to, you know, was that already scripted? Is that, or you had a storyboard where, for example, by the end of that scene, or when you were discussing that with your cinematographer, that there are elements within that scene that I want to capture because I've seen similar things in the other character's story that I want to match visually later on. Is that how you worked when it comes to sound visuals?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you read the script, they'd probably still kind of make sense as kind of stories. Well, they do definitely still make sense as kind of stories and how they thematically kind of link. But it's really helping the audience to make kind of connections, between kind of the stories. Because, of course, if I put them in a similar kind of position within the composition, I'm saying very kind of concretely, but also kind of quite subtly, this is kind of the same character. You know what I mean? They are experiencing something which is kind of connected and which is kind of similar. So on a very simple level, just kind of visually as an audience, you make these kind of connections because you're kind of subconsciously going, that composition is very similar to the composition which I just saw. So there's a conversation and a dynamic and a dialogue between those two things. So it's really as almost as kind of simple as that, as making sure that the audience understands that there is a connection between them, and the connection is story, but also kind of visual and compositional. But a lot of the sound design was actually already in the script, and the same with.
This is what I wanted to ask you about. One more thing, the sound, especially in the scene when the two guys are driving.
Cuts out in the car. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Was that scripted or was that later on added?
That was really interesting because shooting that scene, we couldn't. I had to do something which I don't normally like doing, and that is that if I'm shooting someone in a car, I normally just like the cameras to be attached to the car, and we just film that way, and the person driving is actually driving. But the guy who I cast couldn't drive, so we had to use what's called a low loader. So it's this other kind of truck that you have kind of in front of the car. But low loaders are extremely noisy, so it meant that I couldn't use and we had to have the windows down to be able to kind of shoot through them. So all of the dialogue from that scene is unusable. You can't do it. So after we've shot the scene, we have to do what's called wild tracks. So where they just kind of re-go over the scene and kind of we just kind of record it, we don't film it. And as I was sat in the back of the car and listening to them doing it, I really liked the way that the one guy was delivering it quite softly because it felt very intimate in that moment. So I got them to do it kind of softer and softer and softer. And then when we came to editing, we had the wild track of kind of the sound of the car, and we were using kind of the wild track takes and quite a kind of soft take. And it was very early in the editing that we were just, we were kind of past rough cut and we were kind of just starting to kind of refine it. And the editor is kind of doing something, changing visually kind of some of the cuts that I kind of want to do, and then he starts to replay the scene, but on the Avid, he's forgotten to put on one of the car tracks. So we're watching the lead up to the scene, and then we cut into the car, and all of a sudden the sound of the car drops out. And then he stops it and he goes, "Oh, sorry, I just put this back on." And I was like, "No, hold on, can you just play that again? Don't turn that on." So we watched it again, and it just had this really interesting effect, that it was like as soon as that car disappeared, you had this extreme level of kind of intimacy in the car. And again, it's kind of what I was talking about. All of a sudden you're in reality, but then you're still in reality, but you're actually in the characters. And it also had this other really interesting effect that when we went to the POV of the car, with kind of no sound on it, it felt like that was really speaking to kind of the interior of this one character. It felt like all of a sudden that image was becoming about this kid hurtling down the road just in his own head. And it kind of had all of that effect. So it was an accident, which we then kind of refined to kind of make it work within the scene, Which normally those things kind of happen on set, that kind of an accident kind of happens and you go, actually there's something interesting in that, let's see if we can kind of work with it. But here it was something in the edit.
How hard would you say is it to get funding for like one of your films?
I mean, I haven't had any problems yet. I mean, to get the money for Better Things was kind of the hardest because I'd done 2 short films and they'd done very well. They'd kind of played the big festivals and they'd won a lot of awards, so there was already this idea of kind of like, okay, maybe he's ready for kind of a feature film. You know, enough people are interested, enough people are kind of talking about his work that maybe he deserves kind of a bigger canvas. So we were discussing that, but then when I turn up with a film which is about kind of heroin and kind of a rural community that I want to do with non-actors that has no story, you know, and I want to shoot it on 35mm in anamorphic in the middle of winter, you know, they're kind of like, oh, okay, really, you know. But so convincing them to kind of do that was kind of a little bit kind of hard, but they were very, very good at me. You know, they allowed me to do everything that I kind of wanted. You know, I wasn't told that I had to work with actors. I wasn't told that I couldn't shoot on film. You know, I wasn't told that it's like, okay, the editing has to be faster or anything like that. They were very, very good. And then because we played at Cannes and because we kind of won awards with it, it was like, okay, you've basically kind of fulfilled the remit of kind of them kind of giving you the money, because financiers always have this thing about, you know, when they give you the money, they're kind of backing you, you know? And, you know, they need the film to go off and kind of do something, or to play a big festival to be kind of vindicated in their decision. But then once you've done that, it's kind of like, you know, okay, maybe you kind of get the opportunity again. And Bypass was strange because Bypass I could have shot maybe a year and a half, even 2 years before I actually did. The money was in place way before we actually kind of shot it. We actually had to shoot it for less money than what we had 2 years before, but I just felt like the script wasn't ready. And also we'd done some preliminary casting and I couldn't find the actors that I wanted. So the financiers were a little bit kind of annoyed because I said, look, I don't think the script is ready. I think we actually have to kind of wait and let me go off and kind of carry on working on the script. And then during that period, some of the money that was going to come from Germany dropped out, basically because they changed the remit of like the public funding system. Not because they didn't want to do the film, but basically the money that was available for kind of co-productions to shoot a film in the UK disappeared. But we still got money from Sweden because of Ruben and Eric's company. But yeah, you know, I think it's getting harder and harder to make these sorts of films, but it's, you know, you just have to find a way. And really it just means that you have to shoot it on kind of a little bit less money, which is kind of becoming the case, I think, you know. But they always, you know, they always say that it's kind of, I think it'd be very hard to make a film like Better Things now, but, you know.
Do you rehearse a lot with actors before the shoot?
That really kind of all depends. It all depends if I think the person needs it, and it all depends if I think it's going to kind of harm it. So with the short films I did, with Field I did none at all because I was worried that the kids were going to start then acting, and I was really kind of concerned about that. Love Me was a little bit different because I'm asking these kids who are only kind of 16 to do quite kind of intimate things in front of a camera crew. So I felt that was just unfair to kind of do that without kind of rehearsing with them and getting them already very comfortable with each other, comfortable with me and comfortable with the crew. So that was really just to break down kind of inhibitions. Exactly the same with Better Things. It was kind of like, okay, if it's a dialogue scene, then I want to make sure that they know their dialogue, but I won't actually rehearse with them in terms of kind of trying to get the correct emotion or anything like that. Bypass was different. Bypass I rehearsed quite a lot with George, and with the other actors as much as I could. But with actors you kind of get less time because, you know, they're normally on another project or there's some other reason, so it's quite limited as to kind of the time that you get with them. But so some scenes I would, other scenes I wouldn't, and that would just depend on the time that I got to work with the person, you know. It's more, for me, it's more about having kind of conversations with them and kind of getting comfortable with each other than it is necessarily about kind of rehearsing the scene.
Yeah, that was actually my second question. For how long did you have George? Because like, to have him lose weight, he must be like...
I think he was losing weight for about 3.5 months. but he was actually on another job until I think maybe 8 weeks before we were shooting. But that wasn't a problem because by the time he came off it, his weight loss wasn't really starting to show really a lot. You know, it wasn't until kind of a month or so before we're shooting that I'd kind of meet up with him and it would be like, okay, you're really starting to look different. You know, you're starting to look like a very different guy than I met kind of 2 months ago, you know.